Can see my face?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm good.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
Estamos ao vivo. Boa tarde a todos e a todas e todes. Com muita alegria, nós começamos a primeira live da Rede Brasileira de Educação e Trabalho Interprofissional em Saúde. Estamos muito felizes porque hoje nós temos o professor Andreas Xyrichis conosco, nosso convidado especial, que veio do King's College London, da Florence Nightingale School, para conversar conosco sobre a epistemologia do trabalho e da educação interprofissional em saúde. O professor Andreas tem uma publicação muito importante a respeito da interprofissionalidade como ciência, e nada melhor do que nós começarmos a falar sobre esse tema, considerando o compromisso dessa rede brasileira, ReBETIS, com o rigor teórico e o rigor conceitual e metodológico que nós precisamos sempre perseguir e construir nas atividades de educação, de prática profissional e de pesquisa que nós realizamos em todo o nosso Brasil. Então, cumprimentamos a todos que estão aqui conosco, convidamos para permanecerem nesta live que está planejada para finalizar em torno das 16 horas. E gostaria também de me apresentar nesse momento a vocês. Eu sou professora doutora Jaqueline, sou a atual coordenadora da ReBETIS e atuo como docente do Departamento de Enfermagem da Universidade Federal de São Carlos. Então, o professor Andreas Xyrichis é enfermeiro, ele tem experiência na área de cuidados intensivos em unidade de terapia intensiva e, especificamente, em relação ao trabalho em equipe interprofissional desenvolvido nesses espaços. Ele tem sido um apoiador da rede brasileira, da ReBETIS, desde a sua fundação. Ele nos ajudou a pensar em como poderíamos nos organizar aqui no Brasil e tem participado do CIETES há alguns anos conosco, né? Então, nós ficamos muito felizes em tê-lo aqui no Brasil conosco este ano novamente. Outra informação importante a respeito do professor é que ele é o editor-chefe do Journal Interprofessional Care, que é um dos principais jornais que nós temos para realizar publicação e disseminação do conhecimento científico na área da educação e do trabalho interprofissional em saúde. Agora, eu gostaria de passar a palavra para o professor Marcelo Viana, que está aqui conosco e é o vice-coordenador da ReBETIS e também o primeiro coordenador, né, da nossa rede brasileira e um dos idealizadores de todo esse movimento aqui no Brasil.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Gostaria de cumprimentar o professor Andreas, a professora Jaqueline, a professora Bárbara, o professor Cristiano, que está aqui no estúdio conosco, bem como todos os participantes que estão nos assistindo pelo YouTube. Situando um pouco a porquê dessas lives, já havíamos discutido, a gente já vinha discutindo na ReBETIS, na executiva, a importância de momentos que pudessem fazer um adensamento teórico, conceitual, sobre temas que são muito relevantes para fortalecermos esse debate e nossas iniciativas no contexto brasileiro. Então, essa foi uma discussão levantada nas reuniões, e agora nós estamos aqui iniciando essa série, né, esse conjunto de lives, e aí nós ficamos muito felizes que esse início seja com o professor Andrés, por toda a sua história, por toda a sua parceria com o avanço desse tema no contexto brasileiro. Então, ao mesmo tempo que eu quero agradecer a todos e a todas por estarem assistindo a primeira live, quero também já convidar e deixar aqui registrado que vamos fazer outras lives importantes como essa, e que vocês fiquem atentos às nossas redes sociais, acompanhando os informes e as datas das próximas lives. Muito obrigado a todos e a todas. Obrigado, professor Andreas, por estar conosco.
Obrigada, professor Marcelo. Queria também registrar um trabalho intenso da professora Bárbara Lima, da Unixal, que está aqui conosco, fazendo também todo o bastidor, né, da organização, como membro da equipe de comunicação da ReBETIS, para viabilizar a realização dessa live no YouTube com todos vocês. Então, nesse momento, gostaria de passar a palavra para o professor Andreas Xyrichis. Dr. Andreas, this time is yours. You have around 1 hour to share your explanation. And after that, we will open to a debate with our audience. Thank you so much for your collaboration with our Brazilian Network for Interprofessional Education and Practice. We are really happy to have you here today, and we will be delighted with your presentation. The time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline, Marcelo, Barbara, everyone who's supported this. I'm delighted to be joining you, both live through this stream, but also in person, as I'm currently in Brazil, hosted by the University of São Carlos. I've put together some slides at the request of ReBETIS on epistemology, interprofessional education, and collaborative practice. I will reflect on some of the considerations that I have been puzzling with through my career in research in this area of scholarship. And I want to share some of my reflections with you, and my intention is that we can create a reflective space for discussion, so we can all learn from, with and about each other on this important topic. Allow me to begin my presentation with some background information about. Let me just pause right there. And we're back. Okay. Technology being where it is, wonderful opportunities, but also challenges at times. So let me start, colleagues, by saying a few things about my so you can appreciate where I draw my inspiration for this presentation. I expect that many people on the call will be familiar with the UK Centre for the Advancement of Interprofessional Education, where I have the pleasure and privilege to sit on the board as director and trustee. CAIPE is a charity established in the 1980s in the UK with the mission of improving health and social care of the public through the advancement of interprofessional education. CAIPE supports colleagues from around the world, students, academics, practitioners, and researchers by sharing information and enabling networking opportunities. I also come as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Interprofessional Care, a journal that was also set up about the same time as CAIPE, with a mission of promoting collaboration in education, practice, and research worldwide. It always has been and remains a firmly international journal. The journal has increased in size, reach over the years. In the latest impact factor results, 2021, we achieved a 5-year impact factor of 2.8, which is our highest to date and places us at the top quarter of the size score percentile for the general medical journals category and the second quartile for the health services and policy category. This is not only a testament to the success of the journal, but also of the interprofessional field, signifying that scholars in other disciplines and settings, perhaps more broad and not as niche as we are starting to read, to cite, to refer to the journal as a mainstream journal in healthcare. A number of our articles are picked up by social media, former national news outlets, as well as policy document, as attention to our field of scholarship is growing. On the right, I have included a recent graph sent to me by the publishers that shows the submissions that we'll be receiving by country, and I'm delighted to see that Brazil now features in the top 5 countries for submissions to the journal, citations from the journal, and downloads from the journal. So Brazil is becoming rapidly an important intellectual force in our field of scholarship, and I'm delighted to be supporting these initiatives so that the scholarship can grow further. My day job is at King's College in London. King's is a very traditional university. It is the 4th oldest university in England, founded in 1829, and currently one of the top universities in the world. Within the health sector in particular, King's has 180 years of historic pioneers, including James Clerk Maxwell, Einstein's predecessors. Some of his formulas have been instrumental in development of electromagnetism, MRI, and other medical technologies. Florence Nightingale pioneered, transformed nurse education in the UK and across the world. And people like Lord Lister, considered by many as the father of modern medicine and the lead in asepsis techniques. King's has over 30,000 students from 140 countries and claims to be the largest provider of health professional education in Europe. A very, very traditional university, an English traditional university, and a very traditional medical and health professions faculty. Still, King's has pioneered interprofessional education in the UK for more than 2 decades now. Because as a traditional university, King's also has the ability to lead change, improvement, and innovation. With that in mind, I'd like us all to revisit and remind ourselves of what it is that we're here to discuss. A definition of interprofessional education has been set over a number of years by the UK Centre for the Advancement of IPE and others. At its heart, it is this beautiful phrase where students, professionals from different professions come together in opportunities to learn with, from, and about each other, with a specific purpose being to improve collaboration, quality of care, delivery of health services. We must appreciate that there is a continuum of what we might call as collaborative learning. When most universities, most groups start to initiate this kind of education, we see more examples of what can be described as shared learning. In the left corner of my graph here, this is where students from different professions may come together, may sit next to each other to learn with each other about a particular topic. That, however, doesn't quite constitute what we would like to be referring to as interprofessional education. Learning with each other is a starting point, of course, and it's a structural starting point for much of interprofessional education. But it's not at the heart of what we're talking about. To reach true interprofessional learning, we must remember that we require of our clinicians and our students, in addition to with, to also learn from each other and to learn about each other. The purpose of the interaction, and there must be an interactive element in this learning, needs to be to improve collaboration. Other forms of education may, of course, also be welcomed and positive in health professions education, but if they're not designed to enable that interactive element among clinicians and students, allowing them to learn with, from, and about each other, specifically to improve collaboration, then I'm afraid we need to be hesitant in calling that interprofessional education. In this lecture on the epistemology of our field, I think it is important that we maintain this theoretical fidelity to our key concept. This is not, of course, to discourage any initiative that is not quite there yet, but it is a reminder of what we should be striving for. Interprofessional education as a precursor and a driver for interprofessional collaborative practice sits at the core of global initiatives to strengthen systems for health through strengthening both education as well as professional practice. Interprofessional education and interprofessional practice are inextricably linked with each other and linked with the principle of strengthening health systems, optimizing health services, improving health outcomes. This is how the World Health Organization has positioned interprofessional education and collaborative practice, and how we must perceive it. I do like this figure from the WHO because it sensitizes us to the different number of aspects that we are concerned with as a field of scholarship. Education, of course, but also practice, needs assessment, health outcomes, delivery of health services, health workforce, and so on. There are different aspects to our field of scholarship beyond interprofessional education itself, and aspects that we do need to start to consider, since interprofessional education does not exist and operate in a vacuum. It exists in a wider system of issues, all of which we do need to start to consider. This is the driver behind a recent attempt to consolidate our field of scholarship, to bring research on these different aspects together towards a more unified body of science, a field of study which I previously described as interprofessional science. A scientific field of study devoted to advancing pedagogies, ways of learning, applied processes for collaborative practice, and research methods to understand interprofessional education and collaborative practice, all striving to promote the uptake as well as the evaluation of collaborative approaches in health and social care across education, practice, and research. There are multiple aspects to our field of scholarship. Primarily, and the focus of much of the discussion today is on interprofessional education. Quite a bit of what is being published and what is being discussed in many venues and conferences refers to practical efforts to implement interprofessional education, how to organize groups of students and staff, how to come together in a classroom, ways of encouraging students to interact, learn with, from, and about each other. As we are growing as a field of science, we need to dive deeper into all these aspects to increase our conceptual, theoretical sensitivity to these issues. Within education, for example, we need to develop our pedagogies, our theories of learning, of knowledge. Issues around delivery of IP, ways, methods, as well as increasingly in-person and online delivery of IP. Issues around application of education, issues around interprofessional education in clinical settings, as well as university settings, issues around residency and professional socialization as itself a way of interprofessional identity development and education. Outcomes here refer to attitudes, knowledge, skills, and behaviors. And there can be different kinds of all of these outcomes, different kinds of attitudes, knowledge, skills, and behaviors. And different kinds of pedagogies may be better or less suited to address each of those outcomes. We can make similar arguments for the other pillars of interprofessional science, as I've presented them here, on interprofessional practice and research, questions around workforce planning, optimal composition of healthcare teams, distribution of roles and function, negotiation of jurisdictions, care interventions, ways in which this can be more or less collaborative, issues around safety, quality, coordination, utilization of services, satisfaction, and many more outcomes all relate to this field of practice, And of course, we need to develop our methodologies, our innovative, conceptual, empirical, and epistemological reflections. So I hope this lecture is a start towards that pathway. I am presenting today and in this slide is by no means a definitive form of interprofessional science or epistemology of our field. This is very much a dynamic and growing area, which is why I very much wanted this to be a reflective space, an opportunity for us to discuss and exchange views. ReBETIS has grown over the years that I've known. I have very recently observed, attended lectures by many of you on aspects of methodology, evaluation, different kinds of designs and approaches, different kinds of theories to drive evaluation and assessment of IP. And therefore, I will not repeat questions, practical questions or methodological application, because I do believe that you are evolving past some of those discussions, because I do know that you have skilled people among you that have expertise in these areas, expertise that they are willingly sharing, as I've seen in recent venues. Therefore, I'd like to challenge us all to consider some of the more conceptually challenging, if not stimulating, issues of our field, to talk about what might be a philosophy of interprofessional education and collaborative practice, epistemology itself being a branch of philosophy, of what it is that we are discussing when we say interprofessional education and collaborative practice, and what do we learn and how can we learn more about it. In sharing my reflections in the next few slides, I hope to stimulate discussion, I hope to raise questions among you, and I would like to clarify that these views in no way represent the different groups of which I'm part and I lead. Discussions around philosophy, epistemology of our field need to be debated in various forums across the world so we can come to a more unified conclusion. So at this stage, we are not there. So I'm presenting today as my philosophy of interprofessional education and collaborative practice. In no way completely representative of our field, but I hope interesting enough to stimulate others to think in this space and to engage in discussion with me on some of these issues. Philosophy, as applied to this particular topic and lecture, can refer to mainly three key branches called ontology, epistemology, and methodology. Three beautiful Greek words, which I'm very familiar with. Ontology referring to our way of being, how we see the social world, how we perceive it. We all have assumptions, things that guide our way of seeing the world. So here, I'll say a little bit about how I see interprofessional education and collaborative practice as a social phenomenon. Through epistemology, ways of knowing, of studying, of learning more about our reality, in this case, IPCP. What kind of knowledge can we gain about this field? How much can we understand about interprofessional education and collaborative practice? And at what level? Methodology, of course, being about ways of learning, about and I would argue improving interprofessional and collaborative practice. As I mentioned, I've seen excellent examples of people speaking on methodology, and therefore I will focus more on the first two issues around ontology and epistemology, with implications, of course, for methodology. As I mentioned, we all have our assumptions, and here I am presenting my philosophy of IPECP, and therefore I should declare that my view of science is one of pragmatism. Pragmatism as a philosophy originated, well, 100 years ago plus, actually. But at its core, and there's many authors in this area which I will not mention, but at its core, what I want you to understand about my way of seeing is that science should strive to benefit society. It should try to inform our way of thinking, our way of practicing, policies that guide our life and indeed in the professional education and practice, and our behaviors. There is undoubtedly merit in purely theoretical work and philosophical work in this sense. But my preference, my assumption, my bias, my starting point is that whatever we do in our science, in the professional science, should strive to benefit society. So it should be applied in one way or another to a more or to a lesser extent. There are different and some would say competing epistemological paradigms in all fields of science, and of course I would argue in our field of scholarship and indeed science. I'd like to talk about some of the main ones, some of which I have seen many of you speak of and speak about, and of which I have a sense you may be more or less familiar with. And then I will introduce an alternative, slightly different way of thinking. Not as the correct one, but as something to encourage more reflection and action. Many will be familiar with the paradigm of positivism. The ontological assumptions of positivism concerning the nature, what is interprofessional and collaborative practice. The assumptions underpinning positivism can be described as behavior, of course, desired behavior in our sense, collaborative behavior, can be specified. There could be causal relationships that can be established, that can lead to the desired behavior. An assumption that interprofessional education and collaborative practice is stable over time and over context. It is fixed, it is predictable. And that being fixed and predictable, it can be fully, objectively defined and measured. In terms of the epistemological assumptions of positivism, how can knowledge about interprofessional education and practice be acquired? Assumptions about general laws, rules, on whether and how interprofessional education and practice can be objectively established. Interventions that can be standardized and fixed, routinely and repeatably applied consistently. Assumptions about interventions having a linear effect on outcome. X leads to Y every time. Questions within the positivist paradigm refer to effectiveness of interprofessional education and collaborative practice. How effective is IPE to improve collaboration, to improve organizational outcomes, to improve attitudes, behaviors, patient outcomes, following our usual IP outcomes that we tend to use. What interventions improve collaborative learning and practice in this linear fashion? What interventions improve learning care and how patient care? What is the most effective way? One way, the most effective way to foster collaborative practice. I've deliberately phrased some of these sentences to be on some level challenging, but on another level perhaps more conventional. Some of these questions are valid questions, good questions we should be asking. So positivism in itself isn't an approach to be avoided, but it's a way of thinking, which is often contrasted with the idea of constructivism. The ontological assumptions of constructivism, what is the nature of IPCB, refer to it as highly contingent, changeable, adaptable, dynamic, emergent, depending on the people, the processes, the context that exists. It is not fixed. It cannot be understood in isolation from other factors like task pressures that people face and challenges, assessment deadlines, work complexities, and so on. It's highly contingent on these issues. Professionals or students of IP must continually adapt on how these situations change, reprioritize goals, actions, and change behaviors. So behavior is not a fixed construct, it continuously changes. Interprofessional education and collaborative practice is not a fixed process, it's not a natural, occurring, objective, independent process. It is a social process that is created and recreated through interaction, and perspectives about it are co-constructed by those who are present. It is not fixed, objective, and therefore questionable from the extent to which it can be measured, predicted. The epistemology of constructivism would have us see interprofessional education and practice as involving subjectivity. Knowledge, understanding about it involves a great deal of subjectivity, of individuality, of interpretation. Contextual, environmental, organizational factors, cultural factors are indeed important in how we perceive in the professional education, collaborative practice, how we understand, how we build knowledge of it, and therefore changeable, adaptable, depending on all issues. So IPCP can evolve over time and should indeed be studied over time, not seen as a stable construct. What is seen as IP today may look slightly different in a few years' time. Research questions of IPCP under this paradigm that people call constructivism can be about how do these factors, task, contextual, organizational factors, how do they combine to affect interprofessional education and collaborative practice? What are the skills that are needed to achieve interprofessional education and collaborative practice, these adaptive skills? What are the aspects of our system, whether it be a healthcare system or education system, that challenge interprofessional education and collaborative practice? And how do they differ among countries, settings, times? And how can this phenomenon that we call interprofessional education and collaborative practice, how does it change over time? In what ways? What are the drivers for the change? Again, I wouldn't disagree with any of these arguments of constructivism. They're all valid points that need to be looked at. Some a bit stretching, more stretching than others. Often, and I've seen in discussions, debates, presentations, people place positivism and constructivism on opposite ends, in competition with each other. and often people will sit in one side or the other. I would argue that a mature science learns to navigate across both paradigms, depending on the questions being asked, the needs of the discipline at a particular point in time, viewing the merits and the limitations of paradigm and approaches. I would, however, also pose that we don't always have to operate in this bipolar way of thinking. There are many other paradigms, philosophies, and approaches that we need to start to consider, to reflect on, to try and apply in our field to see what works best or what doesn't. One kind of paradigm that I'd like to introduce through this lecture is this idea of interactionism as slightly different from the idea of positivism or constructivism. And I've set here some assumptions of, again, I should clarify, my interactionist philosophy of interprofessional education and collaborative practice. So in terms of what it is, interprofessional education, collaborative practice, how I see, how we can approach this area, there's three main ontological assumptions I would like to propose for us to think about. I would argue that collaborative behavior isn't necessarily predetermined or fixed. It can be trained in ultimate and definitive detail to guarantee reproduction. But I would argue that collaborative behavior, collaborative learning by students and professionals is influenced by the meanings that students and professionals assign to people they encounter, other colleagues, or indeed patients or family members, things in terms of equipment or we deal with in healthcare, or indeed situations, urgencies, deadlines, and so on, whether in education and practice settings. I would argue that behavior is influenced by those meanings, not necessarily determined by them. So these meanings, as I call them, about collaborative practice and learning are not fixed. They don't exist in isolation, in vacuum, independent. They're not there for us to pick up and measure. But these meanings arise, are developed, are formed out of interaction, social interaction, past and present, between students and professionals. Positive interactions, in terms of having a more positive effect on people, will create perhaps positive meanings of collaborative behavior. Negative ones may create negative meanings. Meanings can change, but arise out of social interaction. So understanding and shaping these meanings is important and influencing collaborative behavior. And these meanings, I argue, can be handled through an interpretive process. So people interact, people relate, people discuss, people interpret others' reactions, words, statements, actions, interpret what this means. And then these meanings, as interpreted, are used, sometimes revised, people can change their minds, to inform collaborative behavior. In outlining these three ontological assumptions, I argue that while there are limiting factors that condition collaborative practice, contextual factors, policy factors, financial, hierarchical factors, and so on, these are not self-sustaining. So they're not determining collaborative behavior. They influence, rather, the meaning that we have that then influence collaborative behavior. So I argue that limiting factors and conditions are not self-sustaining in their own right. They exist independent, they exist outside of interaction, but rather they are affirmed, transformed, or put aside if relevant, through interaction. So what we do in interprofessional education is facilitate, foster that interaction. In doing so, create positive meanings about collaborative behavior, discussing, critiquing, reflecting on our existing limiting factors and conditions to either reinforce, change them if necessary, or indeed put them aside and move on to something else. So my view of the world in terms of this aspect of science, of interprofessional education and collaborative practice, it's centered on this notion of interaction. And it's this idea, this process of interaction that I think should be the main object of our field of study. Without discounting study of factors, settings, and contexts, of course, we need to understand those in order to study interaction by necessity. Much of my influences are drawn from the work of Bloomer, and have a quote here that I sometimes like to remind myself of. That the task of scientific study is to lift the veils that cover the area that we want to study. It's not to capture reality as something independent, something that's out there waiting to be captured. It is not to accurately represent it, our findings stating that this is the truth, this is the reality, but rather our object of our science is to understand, to see more of what happens, to lift through the veils, peek through the curtain, and see and learn more about our area of scholarship, in this case, interprofessional education and collaborative practice. Viewed in this way, you may start to see that interprofessional education, collaborative practice, this phenomenon that we discuss, this experience, can take place at different levels of exposure and depth, as far as people's perceptions of it are concerned, of course. So therefore, knowledge about it can be, to a different extent, for different people. So those who are ignorant of it, who perceive nothing of it, who refuse to engage with it, read about it, participate in education, collaborative practice, they can effectively know little or nothing of it. Those who participate in it can have greater knowledge of what it is. However, if they are choosing to be naive, unobservant, their knowledge of it may also be restricted. And of course, those who are very observant can have fuller knowledge. So our object of study, interprofessional education, collaborative practice, can be understood at different levels by different people. So when we say this is IP, this is collaborative practice, different people understand different levels of it. So we need to be encouraging, of course, development at a higher level, but not assume that we all understand it in the same way, but assume that we all experience it in the same way, because we don't. So some epistemological assumptions about what I've outlined in terms of scientific knowledge generation. Based on these ideas that I've outlined, scientific knowledge about interprofessional education and collaborative practice refers to those claims we make, whose validity we can be reasonably confident of, although never quite certain. So it's not fully on the positive paradigm, where something is a fact or is not, where certain or is not, but not quite in the constructivist paradigm, where everything is perceived, constructed, and everything can change. There is a reality out there. We can start to learn a bit more about it, and our knowledge claims are those about which we can be reasonably confident of, given our current standards, and so on. So assessments of claims about interprofessional education, collaborative practice, whether that be processes, methods, learning outcomes, evaluations, all of those assessments of claims are based on judgments, our judgments concerning plausibility of what we find and credibility. So there is limitations. There's limitations in how much of IPCP we can accurately capture through our methods. Research findings represent aspects of reality, of aspects of what we know about IPCP, but never arguably complete and full understanding what it is. Whether it be through qualitative or quantitative research, a large-scale survey, a well-conducted experiment, or a really deep ethnographic study, we never capture the reality of what is interprofessional education and collaborative practice in full, in a definitive form. Aspects of it indeed we capture, aspects of it we may miss. So we represent interprofessional education, collaborative practice reality through our findings, but always from some point of view, some sort of theory, set of assumptions, a logic model, indeed our research questions that make some features of our findings more or less relevant. So some things we present, some things we leave behind. So viewed in this way, there can be multiple, non-contradictory, and valid descriptions and explanations of instances and experience in the professional education and collaborative practice. So again, I'm not arguing for the positive approach, but also not the constructive end either. So if I return to the table structure previously shared, this is perhaps how an interactionist epistemological paradigm for interprofessional education and collaborative practice may start to look like. In terms of ontology, or what is the nature of IPCP, we can view structures, training, what we do, the knowledge we generate, interprofessional education programs, as processes that can condition, can influence, but not necessarily determine interprofessional education and collaborative practice. Not every student that completes IPA courses will have a behavior that we can predict accurately. Hopefully, we'll improve the collaborative practice, but the level in which it can do, we remain unsure, and indeed, there could be those whose practice may not be improved. IPCP is influenced heavily by kinds of tasks, pressures, and challenges, but there are common kinds of tasks, pressures, and challenges, whether they be resource-related, time pressure-related, workforce-related. So whilst education, learning, and practice can be influenced by different factors, and therefore not always be fixed as a construct, there are commonalities in kinds of factors that we can learn more about and use to understand the way in which they can, within reasonable confidence, influence collaboration and interprofessional learning. Certain aspects of interprofessional education and collaborative practice can be measured, others can be experienced. So there are aspects of reality, what we call education, collaborative practice experience, that we can capture, perhaps even measure, but it will never be full. So a scale will never capture everything that needs to be captured on interprofessional education, collaborative practice, but it can capture some aspects of that reality. And IPCP is, I would argue, and as I think most will accept, a social process that does operate under permissive limits. So it is dynamic, it can change, but there are limits within which that can happen. So our focus is trying to understand those limits. So on the epistemological front, the argument being, in the assumption being, that yes, we can capture, we can understand aspects of the reality of the interprofessional mediation and collaborative practice. That there are factors, potential, environmental, organizational difference at PCP. These can be in expected ways rather than completely emergent, dynamic, and unpredictable. Interprofessional education and collaborative practice does indeed evolve, though I would argue it evolves on a continuum that we should be able to study over time. So the kinds of questions that need to be asked: what kind of tasks, contextual, organizational factors, educational factors, cultural factors influence interprofessional education and collaborative practice? What are the mechanisms, the ways through which these factors and other social processes influence interprofessional education and collaborative practice outcomes? What are the drivers of change for interprofessional education and collaborative practice over time? And what are the commonalities between these factors over different countries and regions? So as you may spot it, the approach that I've presented, interactionist approach, CAIPE, doesn't necessarily or strictly, forcefully contradict positivism or indeed constructivism, but as I said, presents a slightly different way. I would argue perhaps a bit more nuanced, a bit more interesting, but in any case, something that can be reflected on, discussed, and debated. Which raises questions. What sorts of questions under this epistemological paradigm should we be asking of interprofessional education and of collaborative practice? Questions that I think should include the following. What are the social and structural characteristics of interprofessional education and collaborative practice? What does interprofessional education and collaborative practice contribute to, and where does it contribute to? We shouldn't assume that all the relevant outcomes of interprofessional education and collaborative practice are already known and fixed and can be measured. There could be others that we've yet to get a clear understanding of. What are the mechanisms through which interprofessional education fosters collaborative practice? In what ways does it change people's faculties, behaviors, knowledge, skills, attitudes at an embodied and intellectual level that foster collaborative practice? How can interprofessional education and collaborative practice be improved? How can our methods, our approaches, our techniques be improved, be subject to a process of ongoing improvement? What kinds of interprofessional education are more likely to achieve which kinds of education and practice outcomes? Group work, online work, small groups, large groups, role play, simulation, presentation, different ways of learning with, from, and about each other, which are associated more or less with certain education, certain practice outcome. So I would argue for a deeper set of questions that we can start to reflect on. As I said, we are all on some sort of journey in this field of scholarship. Some of these questions will be easier to tackle, some will be not. Some will be questions for now, some will be questions for the future. But these are all things that I would like to invite us all to start to reflect on. Not necessarily easy, straightforward ideas, not necessarily ideas on which we all have to agree on, but ideas that I think we should start to reflect, to discuss, to debate. And through this dialogue, through the discussion, through this debate among our community, we can start to shape what might be philosophy in the professional education and collaborative practice, what might be an epistemology for the professional education and collaborative practice. In turn, can give us greater understanding, greater control over the kinds of methods that we apply, whether they be surveys, interviews, observations, video analysis, and many more techniques that many of you have seen being quite skilled and competent in already. So I've gone through my allowed time by a couple of minutes. So I will leave the presentation here, and I would return the floor to the speakers and hope that I've stimulated enough thought for the discussion that I hope will ensue. Thank you for listening to me. Back to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Andreas, for a wonderful presentation you share with us. It is fabulous, your construction and studies about the interprofessional as a science. And it's a huge possibility to everyone advances in interprofessional education and collaborative practice. I will make a very brief synthesis in Portuguese. Apologies about that, but our audience is following this discussion in Portuguese language, so I will share this with them. After, Marcelo will share some thoughts also, and after we will have a debate with everyone. So, foi muito interessante ouvir o professor Andrés com essa construção brilhante que ele fez sobre a ciência, né, da interprofissionalidade, organizada em 3 pilares, né? Então, pensando a educação interprofissional em saúde e os elementos principais que nós precisamos olhar e estudar dentro dela para poder avançar. Então, os aspectos teórico-metodológicos relacionados às pedagogias, às teorias de aprendizagem, as possibilidades que nós temos de avançar nessa aprendizagem online, a necessidade de avançar também na socialização entre as diferentes áreas profissionais, né, durante essa formação. E o outro pilar, então, sobre o qual ele comentou nessa construção da interprofissionalidade como ciência foi a prática. Então, para que nós possamos também analisar a prática a partir da perspectiva do reconhecimento das atitudes envolvidas nessa prática, dos membros das diferentes profissões, os conhecimentos que cada um e cada área profissional tem a compartilhar durante esse trabalho em equipe, a prática colaborativa que é estabelecida, assim como as habilidades e comportamentos que precisam ser analisados e ressignificados para que possamos avançar na colaboração interprofissional em saúde e, ao mesmo tempo, identificar também aspectos relacionados aos avanços que esse movimento traz nas práticas, considerando a qualidade do cuidado, a segurança que é construída nesse cuidado com o avanço da colaboração interprofissional em saúde do trabalho em equipe, a coordenação, que também é um aspecto muito importante para estimular o fortalecimento desse movimento, e a nossa utilização, né, dos serviços de saúde, também considerando a satisfação dos trabalhadores que desenvolvem as ações nos serviços e dos usuários. Por fim, ele falou do terceiro pilar, que é o pilar da pesquisa, no qual nós também precisamos avançar, considerando as metodologias de pesquisa que precisam ser sempre criteriosamente, né, com muito rigor científico, e que o co-design é uma das possibilidades a se explorar também nesse campo da interprofissionalidade, porque traz muita inovação para esse tipo de construção de pesquisa que é compartilhada desde o momento da sua elaboração, assim como durante a coleta de dados, de uma forma também interativa e alinhada aos pressupostos teóricos e metodológicos da EIP. Ele nos apresentou uma figura que vocês devem ter visto bem interessante, nós ainda não tínhamos tido contato, que é uma figura gráfica, então, que mostra o conceito da educação interprofissional em saúde, em que nós temos o aprendizado, né, de diferentes áreas, de uns com os outros, uns sobre os outros, né, e entre os outros, para avançar na colaboração interprofissional em saúde. E aí ele trouxe para nós também algumas contribuições em relação a todo esse movimento da interprofissionalidade como ciência, considerando 3 perspectivas de referencial teórico que nós podemos adotar, com sugestões e sinalizações sobre pressupostos a considerarmos em cada uma delas. Então, ele falou um pouco sobre o positivismo, sobre o construtivismo e sobre o interacionismo, considerando a ontologia relacionada, né? Então, como é que nós vemos a educação interprofissional e a prática colaborativa como ferramentas de fenômeno social dentro dessas 3 diferentes vertentes. A epistemologia, então, qual é o tipo de conhecimento que nós buscamos construir nestas vertentes, e a metodologia, né? Considerando também quais são os caminhos para aprendizagens sobre as melhorias que nós buscamos na educação e na prática interprofissional colaborativa. E, por fim, ele deixou algumas perguntas para nós refletirmos, então, para avançarmos na pesquisa da educação interprofissional e da prática colaborativa, considerando estas vertentes sugeridas como possibilidades de avançar nessa ciência. E essas perguntas foram, então, quais podem ser, né, as características da estrutura social que nós temos relacionadas à educação e à prática interprofissional colaborativa, onde estas atividades e iniciativas são desenvolvidas e como elas contribuem para o avanço da educação interprofissional e da prática colaborativa, quais são os mecanismos que são aplicados para o avanço dessa prática, como que a educação e a prática interprofissional colaborativa pode melhorar nesses diferentes contextos em que nós atuamos e pesquisamos, quais são os tipos de educação interprofissional colaborativa que são desenvolvidos para o alcance de resultados tanto educacionais quanto resultados nas práticas de saúde, porque nós sempre buscamos avançar, né, nessas 2 dimensões, tanto dentro do sistema de saúde quanto no sistema educacional. Então, agora eu queria passar a palavra para o professor Marcelo. Fique à vontade, professor.
Obrigado, professora Jaqueline. Obrigado, professor Andreas, pela excelente apresentação. Na verdade, o meu comentário é só no sentido de reforçar o amplo campo da educação e das práticas interprofissionais. No contexto brasileiro, nós ainda precisamos avançar muito, né, em pesquisas sobre a educação e sobre o trabalho interprofissional, e a fala do professor Andreas traz importantes elementos para nos ajudar no amadurecimento dessas pesquisas. Então, acho que, de fato, nós temos dimensões que são continentais, é um país muito grande e que, de fato, precisamos conhecer melhor as nossas características, as características do que nós estamos fazendo, como as iniciativas elas estão incorporando os elementos teóricos, conceituais e metodológicos da educação interprofissional e das práticas interprofissionais. E aí eu penso que é cada vez mais importante que a gente fortaleça a rede e fortaleça as nossas relações interinstitucionais no sentido de avançar nessas pesquisas. São muitas as possibilidades, mas independente do caminho que a gente siga, a gente não pode abrir mão desse rigor que o professor Andreas traz, né, com investir na educação e na prática interprofissional requer toda uma organização do pensamento, do conhecimento, da prática, da execução, para que a gente possa visualizar no futuro os efeitos de todos esses esforços na melhoria da qualidade da atenção à saúde. Então, eu fico muito feliz, com certeza, a gente precisa, a partir dessa apresentação, fazer a leitura, né, voltar à leitura do texto do professor Andreas, que trabalha a interprofissionalidade como uma ciência, para que a gente possa amadurecer o nosso campo da pesquisa no contexto brasileiro. Nós temos o desafio e precisamos assumir o compromisso que a pesquisa relacionada à educação e às práticas, elas estejam muito comprometidas com a transformação do contexto atual e que a gente consiga elaborar evidências do que estamos fazendo e dos seus resultados. Então, eu novamente agradeço ao professor Andreas e fico muito feliz por tudo que eu aprendi hoje. Muito obrigado, professor.
Obrigada, professor Marcelo. Nós já temos algumas perguntas aqui para começarmos o debate. E a nossa colega Sara Menezes compartilhou a pergunta a respeito do paradigma do materialismo histórico dialético, se ele poderia compor outra possibilidade de compreensão da epistemologia da interprofissionalidade e como aplicar esse paradigma na construção da epidemiologia da educação e do trabalho interprofissional. So, Dr. Andreas Xyrichis, please, could you give us your opinion about dialectical historical materialism, if it could be a possibility to understand the epistemology for interprofessionality, and how can we apply this kind of paradigms to advance in interprofessional education and practice?
Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you, Marcelo, too, for your lovely summary and synopsis comments. On the question, indeed, there is a tradition within this historical dialogue perspective that has lots of relevance and bearing for us in the professional field. And in fact, there are already attempts to apply this in our field of scholarship, specifically from colleagues in the US, who have been doing quite a bit of archival work on some of the older, but still relevant policies, initiatives, conclusions from discussions at various levels on health policy, practice, workflow planning, and so on, and how those discussions, those dialogical moments, helped shape a way of thinking about interprofessional education and collaborative practice as a result, how they've shaped what we now see and understand to be interprofessional education and collaborative practice, and indeed the way that I've been discussing today, the epistemology of this field. There is always rich insight to be gained by looking at our current and past reflection dialogues, discussion points, and dialogical moments. I would expect that certainly within a significant country like Brazil, there would be a very rich historical archive that could serve as a very important data set and data point for people to engage in this kind of research, which could be very well complemented through analysis of some of the more recent initiatives and policies to indeed find the ways in which those moments have shaped what you now have come to describe, discuss as education collaborative practice in the professional field, which could also gives us insight in what is come. Some of those past dialogical moments are likely to be repeated in one way or another, similar way or not, as similar contextual issues appear in terms of socioeconomic or health-related factors and conditions. As I've argued earlier in my speech, I do think that we are very much conditioned by our context, whether that be political, historical, and so on, but that certain aspects of our reality and history have commonalities. Commonalities are somehow repeated, whether that being financial downturns or major pandemics and so on. That through studying those and the discussions that happened during that time, we can get a better understanding of where we are today and perhaps where we're going in years to come. So I hope that satisfied that question.
Thank you, Professor Andreas, for wonderful sharing. Professor Andreas compartilhou, então, que essa construção que ele trouxe para nós, né, sobre a interprofissionalidade como ciência, é uma pesquisa que ele começou a estruturar, né, então são estudos recentes, mas com certeza há outras possibilidades de abordagem epistemológica que podem ser agregadas a essa construção que ele trouxe, e há colegas em outros países, como por exemplo nos Estados Unidos, que têm alguns
Gente, boa tarde. A gente teve uma queda aqui na conexão da professora Jaqueline, do professor Cristiano, do professor Andreas, que estão lá na UFSCar. Enquanto eles estão retomando, o professor Marcelo Viana gostaria de trazer um aviso, né? Divulgar um evento. Vou passar a palavra para ele, enquanto os outros professores se reconectam, tá bem? Pode falar, professor Marcelo.
Obrigado, professora Bárbara. Só alguns avisos enquanto a conexão retorna. Nos dias 28 e 29, na UFRN, na Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Norte, no auditório da reitoria, nós vamos estar realizando a terceira mostra de ensino na saúde e o primeiro simpósio de educação interprofissional da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Norte. São 2 eventos concomitantes que integram os programas de pós-graduação da UFRN que tem alguma linha de pesquisa na área de formação em saúde. E nesse evento nós vamos estar com o professor Dr. Andreas Xyrichis e com a professora doutora Júlia Filipou, ambos do King's College. Será um evento presencial, no auditório, com tradução simultânea, e é um evento gratuito. Então, as inscrições estão abertas, eu posso depois acompanhar as nossas redes sociais, que a gente pode compartilhar e divulgar no Instagram da ReBETIS, o evento, e seria muito bom se vocês pudessem participar desse momento presencialmente. Novamente, aprender com a presença do professor Andreas. Era só essa informação. Obrigado, os professores Andreas, Jaqueline e Cristiano retornaram. Obrigado.
Bom, retornamos após uma pequena queda de sinal. Então, como o professor Andreas falou no início do encontro, né, a tecnologia ela proporciona inúmeras facilidades para a nossa comunicação, mas também tem alguns probleminhas, né, como essas quedas que podem dificultar. Bom, continuando a nossa síntese sobre a resposta do professor Andreas, ele também ressaltou que o momento em que nós estamos vivendo agora, não é, pandemia, pós-pandemia, é um terreno profícuo, frutífero para pesquisas utilizando esse paradigma, né, o materialismo histórico dialético. E o nosso contexto brasileiro, que tem tantas iniquidades, uma situação social peculiar, mas também semelhante a outros países, também é um contexto interessante para realizar pesquisas dentro desse paradigma.
Obrigada, professor Cristiano, pela contribuição. Então, nós temos mais uma pergunta aqui da professora Marina Peduzzi, da Escola de Enfermagem da USP. Obrigada, professora Marina, por estar conosco também. Uma grande apoiadora e incentivadora da educação interprofissional e da prática colaborativa no Brasil, uma referência nacional para nós e também uma das idealizadoras da construção e desenvolvimento da nossa rede brasileira. Então, é um privilégio tê-la aqui conosco, além de ser uma amiga e parceira muito especial. A pergunta é: como aproximar, de um lado, a maior divulgação e presença da educação interprofissional e da prática colaborativa no Brasil, e, por outro lado, avançar também no rigor das pesquisas, considerando os diferentes tempos de ambos. So, Dr. Andreas, how we can advance in interprofessional education and collaborative practice for dissemination in Brazil, at the same time we need to advance in research with rigor, scientific rigor, considering the different times and advances we have in research and in our IPC practice.
Thank you for translating. Thank you for the great question. I have always said that there's much that the world can learn from Brazil because of your rich historical context, your rich history, and some of the uniqueness, but also great experiences you have in this area. I'll take a break because I'm hearing an echo, so I just want to check that. And we're back. So I've always said there's much of the work to learn from experience. Of course, all countries are at different levels. You've got some techniques, methodologies that are far more advanced in this part of the world than in others. Critical theory, in particular, is something that Brazil is, as a country, as a field of science, is especially known for. Of course, primary care is an area that is very much developed in Brazil, and which there is much that we have already learned from the research that some of you on this call have also completed in primary care. You have, from my observation, tremendous ability to capture data from huge geographical areas and from different participation of groups and people. And I'm thinking some examples from primary care and family health teams in particular, where there's been significant and successful research done with some of the validated tools we have at our disposal, team climate inventory, and so on, together with factors that influence certain outcomes and certain measurements. And I think that's the level that Brazil is particularly strong in contributing to. Whilst in other countries we may have some research, quantitative research through scales and so on, because often they're lacking the scale and diversity in terms of sample size and sample characteristics, it limits the extent to which we can run some of our testing and hypothesis development in terms of factors that influence collaborative practice, composition of teams, tenure, years of employment, and other organizational but also personal characteristics. So there's great things that can and have already been contributed from Brazil that, of course, I would encourage even more, both on the qualitative and quantitative side of research. There are significant examples of, from memory, I would say, interview and focus groups studies that have explored aspects of education and collaborative practice using critical lens, using some of the theories and theorists from Brazil that the reality is some parts of the world aren't as familiar with as you are. So to continue, I think, on the path that you're on, and to continue the production of research reports and outputs, I think that's definitely something that I would strongly encourage and hope that there'll be more and more to see. I think that is the trend, as I've shown in some of my earlier slides. Brazil is now a top 5 contributor to the Journal of Interprofessional Care. Rigor is built and grown and developed through experience and practices. In some countries, there is slightly different takes on research rigor and aspects of epistemology. I ran out of time. I couldn't conclude my presentation with a couple of other slides that I had. One in which it raises a cautionary note that too much concern with methodological and epistemological anxieties can sometimes hinder movement, progress, collaborative practicing and research in our area. But some awareness and some reflection can produce stronger and more rigorous results. So I would certainly wouldn't want some of the epistemological anxieties that I've shared to slow down or indeed hinder the production, the amazing production of research from Brazil. But at the same time, I would encourage that we all work together to continue to improve the rigor of the work that we do, so that we all have more confidence in what we're saying in our knowledge claims, from which we can all build from and develop our field of scholarship. So thank you for the really good question, Marina.
Thanks, Dr. Andreas. Tentando fazer um apanhado, né, da resposta que o professor Andreas nos trouxe, ele fala que uma das principais formas de traduzir todo esse trabalho nas políticas públicas é produzindo evidência. A evidência científica ela é necessária para induzir a mudança por meio de políticas públicas. Então, realizar pesquisas, colher dados, produzir dados, a partir do que nós estamos realizando com as pessoas, com os usuários. No contexto da atenção primária, nós temos uma riqueza de experiências. E ele sugeriu que esse pode ser um caminho, né, produzir evidências a partir dos inúmeros fatores, né, que nós temos positivos no Brasil. Temos boas experiências de equipe, né, podemos realizar pesquisas tanto quantitativas quanto qualitativas para produzir diversas evidências. E que, com relação ao rigor, é algo que em todos os países está se buscando, está se aumentando, né? Essa conversa de diferentes epistemologias, metodologias, tanto de ver a interprofissionalidade como de realizar a pesquisa, ela é frutífera, mas que a gente precisa, enquanto grupo, juntos, caminhar no sentido de aumentar o rigor científico para que a gente consiga produzir melhores evidências científicas e mostrar para os formuladores de política pública, para os gestores, para o governo, os benefícios da educação e trabalho interprofissional. Só assim a gente vai promover mudanças. Então, é um círculo que se retroalimenta. A gente produz dados a partir do que estamos realizando, tanto na formação como na prática, produzimos evidências que vão participar das políticas públicas e a gente vai ter um avanço nessa área.
E uma outra perspectiva de referencial teórico que o professor recomendou, que nós poderíamos utilizar também nos nossos estudos, é o referencial da teoria crítica, porque nós temos uma história e um contexto no cenário brasileiro que possibilita e requer estudos nesta perspectiva para avançar na construção também da educação interprofissional e da prática colaborativa. Nós temos mais uma pergunta aqui, da Natália Romeu de Masi, que é estudante de pós-graduação da Escola de Enfermagem da USP. Então, a Natália pergunta, professor, poderia comentar sua percepção sobre a presença do behaviorismo nos estudos e atividades em educação interprofissional? Dr. Andreas, could you please share your thoughts about behaviorism in IPE activities and studies?
Thank you, Natalia. Another really good question. Of course, behaviorism has a place in the study of IPACP. Much of what we do is on behavior. There are interesting techniques in particular, methodological techniques and approaches that we can draw from in studying behavior, some of which we have, in fact, been drawing for a number of years. Primarily, though, I would argue in the study of collaborative behavior occurring in simulated environments, or less so in actual practical settings. There is much, I think, to be learned about people's behavior in actual interprofessional education situations. So how students and clinicians, when engaged in a form of interprofessional education, behave towards each other. The moments they choose to lend a hand, raise an opinion, challenge, critique, or undertake some sort of collaborative activity with them. The ways in which they do it, the mannerisms, the behaviors, all of which could be subject to more scrutiny, more research than perhaps what I've seen examples of which in what we do. I think the main point is that there are, of course, different kinds of approaches and perspectives from which we can draw for our field. And in fact, I would encourage that so that we can enrich our knowledge base through diversity of approaches and perspectives, and in doing so mature our own thought and processes. So thank you, Natalia. That's a really interesting observation.
Thanks, Dr. Andreas. Natália, Andreas fala sobre a importância dessa diversidade de métodos e de referenciais teóricos. Já existe pesquisas nessa área, né, que enfocam principalmente a mudança de comportamento quando estudantes ou profissionais de saúde se engajam em iniciativas de educação interprofissional. Que, fazendo um adendo, né, o professor Andreas não comentou, mas eu gostaria de comentar, a mudança de comportamento é um dos níveis de resultados da educação interprofissional proposto naquele modelo de Kirkpatrick, né? Então, ali nós já vemos a questão da mudança de comportamento. Ele finaliza a resposta dizendo que essa diversidade de métodos e de modelos de referenciais teóricos enriquece a produção científica na área. Nós precisamos, sim, olhar para o fenômeno de diversas formas e com olhares diferentes.
Obrigada, professor Cristiano. Nós temos mais uma pergunta aqui da professora Bárbara Lima, da Unixal, de Alagoas, e ela diz que, na realidade dela, as grandes dificuldades para se desenvolver pesquisa de qualidade são a falta de recursos e tempo, devido às diversas demandas que o ensino da graduação traz. Dr. Andreas, Barbara Lima is sharing a question. She's saying that in her reality, they are facing difficulties for quality research development because they have a lack of resources and time, considering the increasing of demands for undergraduate teaching. And I would like to add that is our reality, not just the Barbara. It's a common issue, especially in federal and public universities in all of our country.
Well, thank you for that, Barbara and Jackie. I would agree that that is also a reality in many universities across the world, and certainly even in our university, where there's such a huge demand now to train workforce, given the huge needs the world is facing for many reasons, not least the pandemic. So time for research is indeed harder and harder to find as our resources. There isn't an easy answer to this. What I can share from my experience at the UK, King's and CAIPE and other groups is that, of course, we do have restrictions in how much and how big sort of our projects can be, but it is through networks like ReBETIS and CAIPE that we can work together, so we can share the work a little bit, and we can all contribute to our best of capacities and abilities towards our research, our project, our knowledge generation. What we found a few years ago in the UK through CAIPE work is that we had a number of scholars, of professors, and of groups that did similar kinds of research, but in slightly different ways, different times, different settings. So we created our CAIPE research group that has brought people together to coordinate their work. That has meant that some projects have taken priority and others, of course, have taken a sort of a lower order in the list of work. But through sharing the work through the network, there's been more production, both of research articles and of small projects that people have been able to produce. So we are a collaborative community, so we need to maximize on those collaborative capabilities. The other thing we've observed is that many of us, myself included, tend to be distracted by different topics, sometimes too many interesting ideas in our field. And also through the work of my students, I often encourage diversity, but there is something to be said about limiting choice for ourselves as well as for our students. If we have a focused point of research and observation, or which we can all contribute to, including our students in their own ways, small ways perhaps, also of course reinforces. And let's not forget that through research our students do benefit educationally and pedagogically, especially if we have an interprofessional group of students. They also benefit through proper facilitation in terms of collaborative capacity and capability. Collaborative practice in healthcare doesn't just happen in clinical settings, it happens in research settings as well. So it is a challenge. In the UK, I don't see it as a challenge that's going to get any better. Probably will become more difficult as resources are being more constrained and will be more constrained in the years to come. But I do think that we should not, we should be a bit more careful about letting go of our research aspirations. I think despite the difficulties, we should keep carrying on. The reality is that it's very difficult to restart research. So once you are involved in doing research, no matter how small or how little or how slow, you can't keep going. If you stop, it's really difficult to pick it up again. So yeah, better to do less and small than do nothing. And whatever we do will contribute. I'm sure that's not a satisfactory answer, but that's my comment. And I will leave it there, Barbara.
Bom, a partir desse comentário da professora Bárbara Lima, o professor Andreas comentou um pouquinho, né, falou um pouquinho sobre os desafios que eles também enfrentam no Reino Unido, né? É claro que eles já estão há mais tempo realizando educação interprofissional e pesquisa na área de educação interprofissional, mas eles ainda têm alguns desafios. Talvez uma saída, não é, para esses desafios, para essas dificuldades que eles encontraram lá foi o fortalecimento das redes, dos grupos de pesquisa. Então, já que nós temos, às vezes, limitações nas nossas instituições, que a gente consiga se reunir, né, as pessoas que desenvolvem educação interprofissional, desejam pesquisar na área, que a gente se reúna em redes, que é o que a gente está fazendo na ReBETIS, né, e em grupos de pesquisa. E dessa forma, a gente vai se fortalecendo entre grupos, né. Então, esse trabalho que deve ser colaborativo também na pesquisa, né, ele maximiza, potencializa o que a gente está fazendo. E pediu para que a gente não desistisse, não parasse, né. Recomeçar a pesquisa ou recomeçar o trabalho, às vezes é mais difícil do que mantê-lo vivo, né, mesmo que de forma menor, mais espaçada. Então, é preferível, né, que a gente, se a situação está difícil, realize menos, de boa forma, né, continue com nossas ações, porque parar e recomeçar é muito mais difícil. Os estudantes se beneficiam muito do nosso trabalho em relação à educação interprofissional, assim como os usuários, né? Então, que a gente não desista e continue realizando nossas atividades, apesar das dificuldades. Quer adicionar alguma coisa, professora? Ok. Nós temos aqui mais uma pergunta, não é? Pergunta da Cláudia Fel, né? Ela pergunta: professor Andreas, conversando com alguns profissionais inseridos nos serviços de saúde, alguns referem que as discussões acerca da educação interprofissional e da prática colaborativa ainda se concentram muito nas universidades e no âmbito acadêmico. Que estratégias podem ser utilizadas para aproximarmos os serviços de saúde e os profissionais dessas discussões? Dr. Andreas, Claudia, talking to healthcare professionals. They say that the discussion and the study about interprofessional education is concentrated in the academic field with teachers, professors, and that's a problem. And she asks, what are the ways, how can we approximate the healthcare services and professionals to this discussion?
Yeah, a very good point and a very relevant one, and actually a current one. It is something that we're also working on in the UK, though we have, of course, made progress in this area. It's still something that we need to work even more on. Much of interprofessional education is in universities, as you say, and it is at the pre-licensure level, so at the level of training new clinicians. I have said before that the majority of the workforce are already out there. The people who will be working in healthcare in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, the majority of them are already in the workforce. And we do need to pay more attention to them and to support them and to engage in greater clinically based interprofessional education. It is, of course, through continued effort and initiatives and dialogue with them that we can get there. Different countries have different systems and incentives for education. In practice, we in UK have formal collaboration agreements for education of our students with some practice providers. They are actually now very keen in developing interprofessional education. We recently did a survey in the UK of clinical educators from different professions in different hospitals across the country and primary care settings. One of the, I think, the second top issue that they wanted to discuss, they wanted help with, was how to have more interprofessional education experiences in the clinical areas. So certainly from our experience in the UK, there is a desire for greater IP in clinical settings. The issue is, I think, on the university side, the issue of capacity, capability, at a time when we are already struggling to implement and have solid IP in our university, in classroom-based settings. Taking it further to the clinical setting is another, of course, dimension, which creates additional work and, of course, challenges. We do now have at King's and in other universities in the UK what we call a users group. So we have colleagues from the clinical setting alongside often some patients or family members who are interested, forming groups that act as kind of advisory groups or input groups to how we develop our interprofessional education. And they often come with good examples or good ideas on how we can bridge this sort of space between IP in the clinical setting and in the university setting. And by having some of those clinicians there, they are often in a position to communicate some of these issues with their colleagues in a more immediate term, in a language that is more accessible to them. And in doing so, creates more awareness, interest, and possibilities, opportunities for that to happen. But it's certainly not a challenge that we've resolved fully in the UK or anywhere else. I don't think it is an ongoing challenge for all of us to continue to work towards and address.
Bom, o professor Andreas comentou que essa é uma dificuldade que eles também passam, né, que eles também sentem no Reino Unido, e que apesar dos esforços, não é algo que está completamente resolvido. Nós temos profissionais de saúde que estão há 10 anos, 20 anos no serviço, e há realmente um afastamento, um distanciamento, não é? às vezes nós esquecemos que eles estão lá há tanto tempo, né? E eles também esquecem que a universidade, a academia é um lugar que pode contribuir com a atualização, com a melhoria do serviço de saúde. Então, esse é um assunto que eles costumam tratar bastante, né? De como fazer essa integração ensino-serviço. Então, uma das estratégias que eles usam é diminuir a quantidade de atividades no cenário acadêmico e ir para o cenário clínico, ir para os serviços de saúde, né? Então, estar no serviço de saúde, realizando a educação interprofissional, é uma forma de aproximar o ensino do serviço, né? Dos acadêmicos, dos profissionais de serviço, né? Então, estar lá e levar essa discussão para dentro do serviço já é uma forma de aproximar. Outra coisa interessante é a formação de grupos de usuários. E aqui, de novo, a gente chama a atenção, não é, para a centralidade do usuário no trabalho colaborativo interprofissional. Então, a partir de grupos de usuários, saem várias ideias, exemplos, estratégias de como a educação interprofissional ela pode se aproximar do cenário prático. E, por fim, ele comenta que nós temos esse dever de nos comunicar com os nossos colegas profissionais de saúde, né? Que a gente faça um trabalho ativo de conversar, levar ideias e modificar essa linguagem, que para nós a linguagem acadêmica é muito comum, mas a gente precisa fazer uma mudança da linguagem, a gente precisa utilizar a linguagem que é utilizada nos serviços de saúde para que a gente possa fazer essa transposição do conhecimento. Então, a língua é algo, né, a linguagem, não a língua, a linguagem, a forma de comunicar também é muito importante para esse processo. Bom, não sei se temos mais perguntas. Temos aqui alguns comentários sobre certificado, que é necessário registrar-se na frequência. A Cláudia agradece o professor Andreas pela excelente apresentação e reflexões, e também parabeniza a ReBETIS. Cláudia is thanking Professor Andreas for the excellent presentation and reflections, and thanks to ReBETIS to provide these moments. Aline is also thinking about this afternoon of learning with you, Professor Andreas. So there are lots of comments thanking about the sharing of your experience and knowledge about IPE and in this situation about epistemology of IPE.
Yeah, we have many greetings, but we also have a good information to share with everyone about our plans to CAIPE. So I would like to ask Cristiano to share this information. Please, Cristiano.
Oh my God. Só um minuto, gente. Problemas técnicos. Bom, nós gostaríamos de convidar todas as pessoas para participarem do 6º CIETS. A Rede Brasileira de Educação e Trabalho Interprofissional em Saúde, ela nasceu a partir de encontros de pessoas, pesquisadores, estudantes, docentes, profissionais, interessados em avançar na educação e trabalho interprofissional em saúde no Brasil. Então, esse primeiro encontro, que a gente chama carinhosamente de CIETS, aconteceu há alguns anos e nós já estamos na nossa 6ª edição. Então, o CIETS, este ano vai ser realizado virtualmente na região norte, pela região norte. Então, professores, pesquisadores, estudantes, com o apoio da região norte, com o apoio de pessoas, pesquisadores de todo o Brasil, estão avançando na organização desse evento com muito carinho. Nós havíamos inicialmente pensado nas datas de 1º, 2 e 3 de dezembro para a realização do CIETS, mas nós estamos estudando a necessidade de antecipação em alguns dias do CIETS, de 29 de novembro a 2 de dezembro, considerando um importante evento esportivo que vai acontecer no dia 2 à tarde. Então, nós estamos planejando iniciar o CIETS no dia 29, à tardinha, ter 2 dias de discussões, apresentações, compartilhamentos de experiências no dia 30 e no dia 1º, e a gente finalizar no dia 2 pela manhã, que é uma sexta-feira, com a finalização do evento, né, e como a gente sempre faz, com a criação e divulgação de uma carta que traz os nossos compromissos para o próximo ano em relação à educação e ao trabalho interprofissional. Então, como eu falei, esse evento ele vai ser totalmente online, assim como o 5º CIETS, que aconteceu ano passado, e este ano o nosso CIETS vai versar sobre o tema a centralidade do usuário para a sustentabilidade da interprofissionalidade na formação e na prática em saúde. Então, gostaríamos de convidar todas as pessoas já para anotar aí na agenda. Quem tinha anotado de 1º a 3 de dezembro, antecipa um pouquinho os dias para participar desse evento. Então, obrigado, professora Jaqueline, pelo espaço da gente divulgar esse evento, que eu sei que é da rede, é nosso esse evento, né? Mas como membro da comissão organizadora e membro da coordenação geral, que é das instituições da região norte, eu fico muito feliz de poder falar sobre o CIETS nesse momento, porque a gente está realmente organizando com muito cuidado e muito carinho.
Obrigada, professor Cristiano, então, por compartilhar conosco tão belas novidades. Nós ficamos muito entusiasmados porque o CIETS está chegando, né, e é o nosso espaço para avançar nessas discussões relacionadas ao rigor teórico-metodológico, conceitual que nós precisamos construir e perseguir aqui no Brasil e no mundo. E, com certeza, também contaremos com a presença do professor Andreas. Desejamos muito que ele esteja disponível para estar conosco e participar desses dias de atividade, mesmo à distância. E, mais uma vez, agradecemos a todos também pela disponibilidade de estarem aqui participando, pensando juntos e construindo juntos esses saberes de maneira colaborativa para o fortalecimento do nosso sistema único de saúde, por uma sociedade mais justa e mais equânime. Eu queria passar a palavra para o professor Marcelo Viana, para irmos já caminhando para a finalização dessa live.
Só reiterar os agradecimentos ao professor Andreas pela disponibilidade e a todos e a todas que estiveram aqui conosco, assistindo e aprendendo com a experiência e a expertise do professor Andreas. Muito obrigado a todos e a todas.
Dr. Andreas.